Greetings, comrades, sisters, and brothers. Welcome to African History Club. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. I welcome all existing members. I welcome those who are joining us for the first time as we take this survey into different aspects of Africa's history and looking at different African regions, and to look at how the contemporary challenges facing Africa is related to Africa's history as well. Obviously, we're looking at phase of history before capitalism became the dominant global means and system of production. So while you may not be able to see a direct connection, it will all make sense because that prehistory also determined the peripheral position that Africa assumed when capitalism became the dominant global system. So today we're going to be looking at Egypt, ancient Egypt, also known as Kemet, spelled K-M-T, and that is how the Egyptians referred to themselves. Kemet meaning land of black people, and this comes from the late Professor Cheikh Anta Diop, A-N-T-A-D-I-O-P, and he is the author of a work which is now becoming better known. It deserves to be much more well known, but I think people are now beginning to realize the significance of his work, particularly his book, African Origins of Civilization, Myth or Reality. So in terms of the success of the high culture of Egypt, and I use the word culture deliberately because I agree with the late Professor Walter Rodney that when you start using the term civilization, it implies that others were quote unquote not civilized. So I prefer the term culture. The culture of Egypt that we will focus on will begin in the year 3200 BC, when Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt were unified by Pharaoh Menses, M-E-N-S-E-S. And if you look at the depiction of Pharaoh Menses, he was what we would characterize as having quote-unquote African features. And we know that because of the contemporaneous depictions in monuments of Pharaoh Menses. So beginning with that fact alone, Anta Diop then posed the question, how could it be that the first Egyptian pharaoh who united both kingdoms was African, and yet the argument is still being made that the Egyptian culture was founded by Indo-Europeans or non-Africans. So from the very beginning, it just did not make sense at all. And yet, Anta Diop labored all his life, all his professional life, demonstrating that because he thought it was very important. And as I discuss his work further, you will see why he believed it was important and why indeed it was important work. And obviously he was working against phenomenal resistance because the Hollywood version of Egypt, Kemet, which depicted all the Egyptians as Indo-Europeans, had become widely globally disseminated over decades and over centuries. Of course, before Hollywood existed, there was already a pre-Hollywood version of Egypt, Kemet, where all the depictions were of Indo-Europeans. So obviously, when you have a person like Anta Diop appearing on the scene with well-researched factual rebuttal, there's going to be a long and hard resistance to try to change the narrative. But yet I think he was very effective in his lifetime to see a shift in the understanding even during his lifetime. and I believe that shift continues today. There's a wider understanding that indeed the origins of Egyptian civilization was essentially African. And even those who still do not accept that, they are coming to the realization that it was substantially or primarily African, if they're not willing to accept that it was essentially African. So in 1974, there was a major symposium in Cairo, Egypt, and it brought some of the most renowned scientists and people that had expertise in ancient Egypt. And they discussed, about 22 of them, they discussed, and at the end of it, the people that were in charge of supervising or organizing that symposium, which was under the auspices of UNESCO, which is, of course, a wing of the United Nations, concluded that Anta Diop and his protege, Professor Theophile Obenga, Theophile Obenga, Obenga, were the most prepared of all of the presenters. And Obenga is Congolese born, and for those that do not know, the late Anta Diop was Senegalese born and taught in the University of Dakar in Senegal. And did they persuade all the other scientists to come to their position that Egypt was an African culture? Of course not. But they were so persuasive that they got all the other scientists to start thinking of their positions. And there was some shift, and in subsequent years, there was even much more significant shift out of that conference. And I'd like to read a little bit from the General History of Africa, Volume 2, Ancient Civilizations of Africa. There's a segment there in the end of chapter 1, which was written by Anta Diop. There's an interesting appendix also to chapter 1, which is actually a summary of that symposium in Cairo. But this is separate. This is chapter 1 itself, and this is toward the end of chapter 1. The structure of African royalty, with the king put to death either really or symbolically after a reign which varied but was in the region of 8 years, recalls the ceremony of the pharaoh's regeneration through the Sed feast. Sed is spelled S-E-D. Also reminiscent of Egypt are the circumcision rites mentioned earlier, and the totemism, cosmogonies, architecture, musical instruments, etc. of Black Africa. Egyptian antiquity is to African culture what Greco-Roman antiquity is to Western culture. The building up of a corpus of African humanities should be based on this fact. Let me read from another section from that same conclusion to chapter 1. In regard to linguistics, it is stated in the report that, quote, this item, in contrast to those previously discussed, revealed a large measure of agreement among the participants. The outline report by Professor Diop and the report by Professor Obenga were regarded as being very constructive. End quote. Finally, from another part. Similarly, the symposium rejected the idea that Pharaonic Egyptian was a Semitic language. Quote, turning to wider issues, Professor Sauneron was one of the other experts who attended that symposium, drew attention to the interest of the methods suggested by Professor Obenga following Professor Diop. Egyptian remained a stable language for a period of at least 4,500 years. Egypt was situated at the point of convergence of outside influence and it was to be expected that borrowing had been made from foreign languages. But the Semitic roots numbered only a few hundred, as compared with a total of several thousand words. The Egyptian language could not be isolated from its African context, and its origin could not be fully explained in terms of Semitic. It was thus quite normal to expect to find related languages in Africa. The genetic, that is, non-accidental relationship between Egyptian and the African languages was recognized. Quote, Professor Sauneron noted that the method which had been used was of considerable interest, since it could not be purely fortuitous that there was a similarity between the third person singular suffix pronouns in ancient Egyptian and in Wolof. He hoped that an attempt would be made to reconstitute a Paleo-African language using present-day languages as a starting point, end quote. So this goes back to some of the elements that Professor Diop and Obenga were trying to demonstrate at that symposium and in their subsequent works as well. That not only do you have the first pharaoh of a unified Egypt, Kemet, depicted as clearly a person with what we call or characterize as African features, but you had other elements, such as the language, for example, the similarities between ancient Egyptian and Wolof, which is widely spoken in West Africa today in the 21st century. And other aspects, such as the fact that the ancient Greek writers, including Herodotus in the 5th century, described Egyptians as black and having woolly hair. And obviously, Herodotus even writing at a much, much later stage in terms of the long history dating to 3200 BC. And he's writing in the 5th century. It was already a long time, and what he's observing is not even close to the original Kemet, Egypt, of 3200 BC. And yet it's still supporting Professor Diop's contention. And then other cultural aspects that are similar to African traditions and cultures that I read from that segment from chapter 1 from the UNESCO History of Africa, volume 2. And then Diop also did something which was very critical. He took samples of skin tissue of mummified remains, and he examined it and tested it at the University of Dakar, where he had built up an institute just to focus on those kind of studies using carbon dating and testing. And he was able to determine that the level of melanin from the skin tissue samples retrieved was of people that were African with a high level of melanin content. So those were some of the demonstrations that Anta Diop was able to do at that symposium. And obviously it was also the subject of his subsequent work, including the book, The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality. And toward the end of this podcast, I will also read very briefly from that book by Anta Diop. And Anta Diop also showed that in terms of the history of cultures that built other empires and kingdoms, it was not isolated. So Egypt, Kemet, wasn't something accidental, because as Africans spread along the Nile Valley, heading in a northern direction, they also built other civilizations. They built the empire of Kush, which we will look at a subsequent podcast. And in fact, Anta Diop says that when it comes to the alphabet, for example, and writing, the empire of Kush, also known as Nubia, was much more advanced in terms of their writing. They had actual alphabets, and actually they were the ones that gave the hieroglyphics to Egyptian culture. So it was not accidental. And then you find that other cultures, empires emerged. Whatever there were significant bodies of water, we saw in West Africa, where the empires of Ghana later on emerged, the empire of Mali, the empire of Songhai, the Congo Empire in Central Africa, the Great Zimbabwe, and Monomotapa in South Africa, and these are just a few. So Anta Diop was showing that far from it, that Egypt Kemet was accidental and could not have been an African culture. It was one of the many cultures and kingdoms and empires that were created by Africans. They did not stop at Egypt Kemet, but went on to found and create other kingdoms and empires. Of course, none of them came as close to some of the magnificent attainments that are associated with Egypt Kemet, because the Nile was unique. There was only one river Nile that provided that confluence of opportunities that led to that particular empire, that particular African empire, reaching the status that Egypt Kemet attained. The river Nile, with its abundant water source, with the fertile banks of the river that emerge after each of the flooding seasons, and the rich soil deposits. That's why that particular African empire, Egypt Kemet, was able to generate that level of surplus that allow it to become a net exporter of food, and then drawing from the gold in the surrounding areas, was able to build that particular empire, which was not unique in terms of Africans building empires, but it was unique in attaining that level of high culture because of the opportunities offered by the River Nile. So I think Diop makes a very persuasive argument. I encourage people that are not familiar with his work to do some more research, and at least, the very least, to read his books. So that is the Egypt that was founded 3,200 years BC. Of course, Egypt later on was the victim of many invasions. But before it was the victim of numerous invasions, Egypt itself was actually an imperial power, as Anta Diop reminds us, and he refers to it as the era of African imperialism, when Egypt not only controlled parts of its southern neighbor, the empire of Nubia, Kush, but also controlled what is referred to as the Near East from across the Mediterranean, extending far into the Near East region across from the Mediterranean. So then that was the Egypt at the height of its power. But then later on, when Egyptian power started declining, Egypt was subjected to invasions from the Hyksos, from the Assyrians, from the Libyans, from the Macedonians, from the Persians, from the Romans, and then ultimately, of course, from the Muslim Arab invasion of the 7th century. And that ended Roman control over Egypt that had lasted for about 6 centuries. But the invasions did not end with the Arab Muslim invasion and Islam became the predominant power, not only, of course, in Egypt, but in the Maghreb, in the North African area, west of Egypt, as we looked at the last podcast. But subsequent to that, there were more invasions. There was the invasion and occupation when Egypt became a part of the Ottoman Empire, and then later on, the French and the British imperialism in Egypt, and the occupation did not end until the 1952 Egyptian Revolution, led by General Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser, whom I discussed in the last podcast as one of the preeminent Pan-Africans of the 1960s. But that particular aspect of Egyptian history we will leave for a subsequent podcast when we start discussing the era of decolonization in Africa that will pick up at that point from the history of Egypt after 1952 and beyond. So this essentially is the summary of today's podcast, focusing on the phenomenal work that Professor Anta Diop was able to do in terms of changing the narrative and the understanding of the origins of Egypt. But as I said, I wanted to read something from his book, African Origins of Civilization, Myth or Reality. And why is this subject important even up today? For a number of reasons. The people that push the narrative of the Indo-European origin of history were not doing it randomly or accidentally. They were doing it as a part of that tendency to claim that Africa had no history. Because obviously you cannot reconcile the two. The Hollywood depiction of Egypt, where all the characters are Indo-European, how do you reconcile that with the African origination of Egypt? You cannot. So those who had been pushing the Hollywood version of Egypt had a vested interest in trying to resist people like Anta Diop, who were trying to depict the more realistic history and origination of Egypt. And it also has other consequences in terms of Africans and people of African descent not really knowing their history. Not only does the false history promote white supremacy, on the other side, it also promotes a sense of inferiority amongst some Africans and African descendants who have been brainwashed into believing that indeed they did not have a history, when the history of culture is not only limited to Egypt Kemet, as Diop kept reminding us. All these other kingdoms that emerged in Africa, in different parts of Africa, was a clear demonstration that not only did Africa have a history, it had a history that predates many of the empires that emerged much, much later in Europe. So England, for example, did not really exist until the 10th century. That is a very recent phenomenon when you compare it to the great kingdoms and cultures that thrived in Africa, without even having to mention Egypt of 3200 BC. So that is why it's still a very relevant and important topic to be discussed today. So let me now conclude by reading from this segment from Anta Diop's book. And it basically just reinforces the point that I just made. The ancient Egyptians were Negroes. Obviously, that's not a term that is in wide use today. but it was when he wrote this book. The ancient Egyptians were Negroes. The moral fruit of their civilization is to be counted among the assets of the black world. Instead of presenting itself to history as an insolvent debtor, that black world is the very initiator of the, quote, Western, unquote, civilization flaunted before our eyes today. Pythagorean mathematics, the theory of the four elements of Thales, of Miletus, Epicurean materialism, Platonic idealism, Judaism, Islam, and modern science are rooted in Egyptian cosmogony and science. One needs only to meditate on Osiris, the Redeemer God, who sacrifices himself, dies, and is resurrected to save mankind, a figure essentially identifiable with Christ. A visitor to Thebes in the Valley of the Kings can view the Muslim inferno in detail in the tomb of Seti I of the 19th dynasty, 1,700 years before the Quran. Osiris at the tribunal of the dead is indeed the Lord of revealed religions, sitting enthroned on Judgment Day. And we know that certain biblical passages are practically copies of Egyptian moral text. Far be it from me to confuse this brief reminder with a demonstration. It is simply a matter of providing a few landmarks to persuade the incredulous Black African reader to bring himself to verify this. To his great surprise and satisfaction, he will discover that most of the ideas used today to domesticate, atrophy, dissolve, or steal his soul were conceived by his own ancestors. This is from The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality by the late Professor Cheikh Anta Diop, and it was first published in Paris, 1955. Diop did his PhD in France, by the way. And that itself is another story in and of itself. There was much reluctance to grant him his PhD, but he was able to substantiate with evidence all his positions, and even with all the resistance against his work, he earned his PhD from a hostile environment in France. And just another indication of how solid Anta Diop's work and research happened to be. So that brings us to the end of this podcast. In the next podcast, we will look at Nubia, also Kush, and the thriving culture in Napata and in Meroe. And we will also look at the Empire of Aksum, A-K-S-U-M, sometimes spelled A-X-U-M. And in terms of reference, the reference this week is The African Origin of Civilization by Cheikh Anta Diop, and A General History of Africa, Volume 2, Ancient Civilizations of Africa. The editor is G. Mokhtar. Mokhtar is M-O-K-H-T-A-R. Once again, I thank you, comrades, sisters, and brothers, for joining me on this podcast. Be strong, be well, be safe, and stay Pan-African. Thank you.